Have you ever noticed the strange familiarity in your romantic choices? That inexplicable pattern where different faces somehow carry the same emotional signature, where new relationships echo with traces of the very first person who made your heart race. You find yourself mysteriously drawn to specific traits, recreating familiar dynamics, experiencing the same emotional crescendos and falls. Society calls this coincidence personal preference, or simply your type. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more primordial, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about choice and attraction. Because when you repeatedly find yourself drawn to certain emotional landscapes, you aren't exercising free will. You're following a template imprinted long ago. And that recognition doesn't come with comfortable reassurance or romantic justifications. It comes with a profound realization that what we call choice may be more like unconscious repetition, a psychological echo that most people never truly examine. No, you're not predictable. You're human. You're not stuck. You've simply been operating from a blueprint you never consciously created. There's something profoundly revealing about the way our first experiences of attraction shape everything that follows, because that pattern shatters our illusion of romantic autonomy, dismantles our belief in conscious selection, and reveals a brutal truth. Most relationships aren't new beginnings at all, and most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent, yet deafening mirror of psychological repetition. Freud recognized that our first experiences of intense emotional attachment create what he called imago, an unconscious prototype that guides all future attractions. And this mysterious repetition of relationship patterns is actually a manifestation of what he called transference at work. It's what many experience, but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't examine the blueprint behind their attractions. They follow it blindly. They don't question why they're drawn to the same emotional landscape again and again. They're simply pulled toward what feels strangely familiar. And that makes relationships treacherous because while we believe we're choosing something new, our unconscious has discovered the compelling power of the original template. The person who repeatedly finds themselves drawn to similar types isn't simply expressing preference. They're operating from a specific psychological imprint, a pattern where attraction isn't random, it must follow the original script. Where chemistry isn't spontaneous, it must recreate the initial emotional signature. And maybe that's why it creates so much confusion, so much feeling of fate or destiny, so many moments of inexplicable recognition in new people. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly diverse relationship history is an unconscious faithfully recreating variations on the same fundamental theme established by that first intoxicating attachment. You don't choose randomly, you choose according to a template. And until you recognize that blueprint, you exist in a state of psychological repetition, mistaking familiar emotional terrain for genuine compatibility. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's deterministic, reductive, or an oversimplification of your complex romantic history. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if what you call attraction is actually recognition? Your unconscious identifying in new people the emotional signature of your very first experience of desire. The mysterious pull towards certain types is not coincidence, it's continuity. And those who don't understand Freud's concept of the repetition compulsion often mistake psychological patterns for fate throughout their entire lives. But what few people see is that we don't create this template consciously. It emerges from an experience so powerful, so formative, that it literally reshapes the architecture of attraction itself. Freud believed that our first intense emotional attachments create a prototype that we unconsciously seek to recreate, not despite its painfulness, but often precisely because of the intensity of that original experience. And maybe that's why so many still find themselves drawn to people who activate the same emotional states, recreate the same dynamics, and ultimately lead to the same outcomes as that first overwhelming crush. While most people claim their relationship choices are based on thoughtful selection, the unconscious knows the powerful magnetism of the original template. And there, in the midst of what we call new beginnings, they've encountered not novelty, but recognition. That first crush, when the neurochemistry of attraction flooded their system for the very first time, when their psyche encountered the intoxicating mixture of desire, projection, and emotional intensity that forever altered their understanding of connection. Their repetition of relationship patterns didn't develop from rational consideration, but was imprinted in that formative moment when the template itself was being created. This person knows moments of genuine novelty. They've experienced it. They've had relationships that seemed entirely different on the surface. Different physical types, different backgrounds, different personalities. But somehow, beneath those superficial variations, the emotional landscape remains eerily consistent. And that consistency wasn't created randomly. It was the result of that first overwhelming experience when their young psyche was encountering romantic attraction in its most powerful, unfiltered form. What registered wasn't just the specific person, but the entire emotional constellation surrounding that experience. What emerged wasn't just preference, but prototype. And that prototype becomes psychologically compelling because it combines the familiarity of recognition with the intensity of first experience. They don't want specific traits. They want the recreation of a specific emotional state. They're no longer choosing individuals but variations on a theme, attempts to recapture or resolve that original template. So maybe that's why their relationship history feels so consistent to many observers. Because it's not about external diversity, but internal continuity. And that takes more than surface-level differences to truly break the pattern. It takes the conscious recognition of the template itself, where few are willing to examine what drives their attractions so fundamentally. And that's where many relationship patterns persist across decades. Not because external options are limited, but because the internal template remains unchanged and largely unconscious. They don't want to merely repeat, they want to understand. Until then, they follow the template not by conscious choice, but out of psychological structures they didn't create but inherited from that first formative experience. This person isn't trapped, they're patterned. There's a vast difference between deliberate repetition and unconscious recreation. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this template. A world that still romanticizes the idea of soulmates. A world that still celebrates the mysterious chemistry of attraction as something magical rather than psychological. Freud once said that much of what we think of as destiny is actually unconscious repetition. But perhaps our greatest freedom comes not from denial of the template, but from bringing it into consciousness. And this person's consistent relationship patterns don't operate by random chance. They follow the imago structure. They hear phrases like, "You always go for the same type. Why can't you break your pattern? You should try dating someone completely different." And inwardly, they understand the observation, but feel powerless against the gravitational pull toward the familiar. Because they sense what many don't realize, that what they call attraction is often a sophisticated recognition system where the unconscious identifies in new people the emotional signature it's been programmed to seek. They're not looking for novelty. They're looking for resolution of that original template, often trying to master or heal what was once overwhelming. Someone who unconsciously resembles not a random selection, but a variation on the original blueprint. And let's be honest, that's not something you consciously seek, but unconsciously recognize. The feeling of chemistry they experience isn't mysterious, but precisely calibrated. Their psyche identifying in new people the exact emotional frequency that matches the template. They're living proof that the unconscious seeks not variety, but continuity. And that disrupts our cultural narratives. Conscious choice feels illusory. Romantic free will seems questionable. But they aren't deliberately choosing this repetition. They're responding to a template formed before they had any concept of its lasting impact. And the powerful recognition they feel when meeting someone who matches the template is by itself a brutal indicator of how deeply that first crush reshaped their entire architecture of attraction. This person isn't deterministic by nature. They don't deliberately seek sameness. They understand intellectually the appeal of genuine novelty. And for that, they carry a double burden, both the continuous pull toward the familiar and the intellectual awareness that they may be repeating rather than truly choosing. They desire new experiences while their unconscious demands recognition. They want genuine choice while psychological conditioning pulls them toward recreation of the original template. They long for relationships that break the pattern while their attractions reliably follow it with almost mathematical precision. And when they meet someone who matches the template, it's not coincidence, it's recognition. When they experience that powerful sense of chemistry, it's not random, it's activation of the original emotional signature. When they find themselves mysteriously drawn to someone, it's not fate, it's pattern. And that internal battle between the possibility of genuine novelty and the powerful gravitational pull of the template is their greatest struggle. Because they don't consciously choose to recreate the same relationship dynamics. They're driven by psychological structures largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self between what they aspire to choose and what they unconsciously recognize is what makes their pattern so difficult to break through conscious intention alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this template isn't its persistence. It's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about the nature of human attraction itself. Freud taught that much of what we attribute to free will is actually the expression of unconscious patterns. But what happens when what we call romantic choice is itself largely determined by a template we never consciously created? It was precisely that question that exposes why genuine novelty often feels strangely empty to those whose attractions have been shaped by a powerful original prototype. It wasn't by choice. It was a psychological imprinting that occurred at a time when the very neurochemistry of attraction was being established for the very first time. They no longer experience relationships through romantic illusions alone. They're beginning to glimpse psychological patterns. And that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why you keep finding yourself drawn to people who seem different on the surface, but create the same emotional states? How many times have you felt that strange sense of recognition with someone you just met? This person has felt that too. They once thought this mysterious chemistry was the universe's way of guiding them toward their destiny. But one day, they began to question whether what they were experiencing was cosmic alignment or psychological continuity. And that day, they made the first step toward recognizing a template that had been invisible, yet controlling their romantic life completely. Their path toward awareness is not a straight line. There are days of insight, moments of pattern recognition, nights of wondering why they can't simply break free from the template. But there's also a growing clarity that illuminates what was once completely unconscious. They learned that what they call chemistry often has very little to do with the present person at all. The mysterious attraction they feel is not randomness, but precise recreation. The emotional landscape they repeatedly find themselves in is not coincidence, but faithful adherence to the original blueprint. And until that fundamental template is recognized, they choose to begin observing rather than simply following their attractions. Not out of detachment, but out of the necessity for psychological understanding. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight, that much of what we experience as spontaneous is actually the expression of deeply embedded patterns. They've been shaped by that first overwhelming experience of attraction, formed by an emotional blueprint that permanently altered how their psyche recognizes potential partners, pulled by a template so powerful that it continues to guide their choices decades after its initial imprinting. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of separating conscious choice from unconscious repetition. They don't want just to follow the template blindly. They want to understand how it shapes what they experience as attraction. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding, but psychological awareness. And sadly, few undertake this difficult journey. Most still mistake template following for destiny, pattern recognition for chemistry, unconscious repetition for mysterious compatibility. And if they still find themselves drawn to variations of the same type today, it's because every instance echoes with the original emotional signature. Every experience of attraction they feel is an activation of that primary template. Every relationship they enter follows contours established long ago. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to transcend it. And that awareness born from honest self-observation transforms their relationship to attraction itself. Because a person who has glimpsed the template behind what they thought was spontaneous choice becomes psychologically awakened. Not because their pattern immediately changes, but because they've begun to see what was previously invisible. The person who repeatedly finds themselves drawn to similar types is not making random choices. Something inside them was imprinted long ago, and it was precisely that imprinting that created both their consistent patterns and the potential for their eventual freedom. Because sometimes only in recognizing a template can we begin the long process of conscious choice. Freud suggested that bringing unconscious patterns into consciousness is the beginning of psychological freedom. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with how the template was originally formed, facing the reality of how profoundly that first crush shaped their attractions, patterns that weren't chosen, but absorbed during a period when the very neurochemistry of desire was being established for the first time. They disrupted unconscious repetition by making it conscious. They began questioning what they thought was mysterious chemistry, not by becoming cynical, but by becoming aware. They learned that their consistent relationship patterns weren't random, but expressions of a template established by that first overwhelming experience. And when they stopped simply romanticizing their attractions, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing the pattern clearly. First with surprise, then with recognition, and finally with the curiosity necessary for any genuine transformation. Because someone who has seen the template behind what they called spontaneous attraction no longer mistakes pattern for destiny quite so unconsciously. They learn to notice when they're being drawn to the familiar, to honor the reality of their template while not being completely controlled by it. They're not instantly transformed. They simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind repetition and repetition observed with growing awareness. They still feel the pull toward the familiar, yes, but they've begun to recognize it as pattern rather than fate, not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand, rather than simply continue repeating the same relationship dynamics. Their awareness has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their recognition is a new capacity. They can begin to distinguish between template following and genuine choice. And they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like the mysterious, ineffable nature of attraction itself. Their transformation isn't immediate, it's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom, that humans aren't destined to blindly follow templates created in adolescence, but can, through awareness, begin to make more conscious choices, not to deny the power of the original imprinting, but to expand beyond its limitations. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological freedom, emotional maturity, a person who, though still influenced by the template, is no longer completely defined by it. They're in communion with something greater, with the possibility of choice beyond pattern. And no matter how deeply imprinted their template from that first crush, nothing remains completely unconscious when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply follow their attractions blindly. They observe them with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly recreating the same relationship dynamics without understanding the blueprint. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious repetition to conscious recognition changes everything about their relationship to attraction and choice. But they're no longer identified completely with their patterns. They've already begun to see beyond them. And in that seeing, they discovered that conscious choice might feel completely different from the familiar pull of template recognition. Less dramatic, but more authentic, less intoxicating, but more genuine. There's something profound about the way they now approach their attractions. They don't need to deny the template's existence. Their awareness is expanding. And it's in that expansion that their true freedom lives. Freud said that remember is the first step toward freedom. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply repeat, has become someone capable of eventually making choices beyond the constraints of the original template. They no longer try to simply romanticize their consistent patterns or convince anyone that their attractions are random when the evidence suggests otherwise. They don't deny the reality of the template because they've learned that psychological patterns transform not through denial, but through recognition. And when they feel that familiar pull towards someone who matches the original blueprint, they now pause. They don't engage in self-deception or fatalistic thinking. They observe with the dignity of someone who's followed this template enough times to recognize its signature. What few people understand is that this person still experiences genuine attraction. They still feel the chemistry, the recognition, the powerful draw towards certain types. But they want it with awareness rather than blind repetition, with psychological understanding rather than romantic mystification, with the courage to recognize when they're following the template or potentially breaking new ground. Now they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for genuine choice beyond repetition. And that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional romance. It requires self-awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological patterns and still choosing to evolve beyond them. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for consciousness, a connection where there's real choice rather than unconscious recreation, where both can relate to each other as actual individuals rather than projections or variations on templates established decades ago. And if that seems less magical than the intoxicating recognition they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point. Because they'd rather find genuine connection than continue mistaking pattern following for destiny. And to many still caught in unconscious repetition, that sounds like settling for less intensity. But it's really just psychological freedom in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down you too are ready to examine the template behind your attractions. A template that began with honoring that first overwhelming experience. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both the power of that original imprinting and your growing capacity to make choices beyond its limitations. A clarity that can't be achieved through romance alone, but must emerge from increasing psychological honesty. And if that clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like mysterious chemistry or fate might actually be a faithful recreation of your very first experience of attraction, something worth understanding rather than simply repeating. And if this message found you at the right moment, or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently wondering why they keep finding themselves in variations of the same relationship. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us,